everyone, this is Hanney of Critical Faculty. Today I'm utterly excited. I've been a big fan for years, and today I get to have a chat face to face with the man himself, a historian I've always admired. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bart Ehrman. G'day, Bart, how are you?
I'm well, thanks. Thanks for having me for your show.
Thank you so much. Right, we'll get into this straight away by, well, I've listened to the story multiple times, but I'm sure the folks in the Middle East might have not heard the story. But if you can maybe introduce yourself and tell us, how did you get interested in the biblical studies?
Right. Yes. Okay. So I grew up in a Christian household in Kansas, and my parents were church-going people. I was a church-going person, but when I was in high school, when I was about 15, I had a evangelical born again experience, where I made a commitment to Christ as my Lord and Savior. Became a very committed evangelical Christian, and so this was in high school. And when I had to make a decision about where to go to college, I decided rather than going to a liberal arts college or a secular university, I would go to Moody Bible Institute, which is it's a fundamentalist Bible college in Chicago. And I knew nothing about the place. I just knew I wanted to be I wanted to study the Bible, because now I was just very intensely into the Bible. And so when I went to Moody Bible Institute, I left. I was 17 years old, and I've taken classes. So instead of classes on geometry and Renaissance history and French and things, instead of that, I was taking classes in the Gospel of John, and missionary work and things like that. And so I'm taking this class on the Gospel of John. I'm 17 years old. And this guy teaching the class seems to know everything about the Gospel of John, about the Bible. I'm thinking, oh my God, this is amazing. This guy knows everything. And then about 3 weeks in, I realized, they're paying this guy to do this. I want to do that. So when I was 17, I decided I wanted to become a Bible scholar. And so I did. I don't recommend this to my students. Do not decide on your career when you're 17. But I did. So that's what got me started in the whole thing. And obviously things changed a lot since then, but that's what got me going.
Right. You work with very tricky material. I mean, the material you work with is very religiously inspired. So people who manage that sort of thing, usually theologians or people of the faith, so they've got a bias. But you're a historian. You've got to sort of separate your biases so you can get to the truth of things. You basically watch the likes of William Lane Craig talk about miracles and how it is worldwide, universally acknowledged that Jesus was raised from the dead. Can history, or being a historian, it's a part of sort of scientific method, can prove miracles?
Yeah, I know. Well, I understand people like William Lane Craig and people like him, because I was like that. When I was at Moody Bible Institute, I absolutely would have agreed with all of that. But over time, in the Christian tradition, as you have lots and lots of different kinds of Christianity, but fundamentalist Christianity begins with the assumption that the Bible is the inspired Word of God with no mistakes whatsoever. And if that's your view about the Bible, if you bring that into your study of the Bible, then of course there are no mistakes in the Bible. And if you see something that looks like a mistake, it's not a mistake. And if it says Jesus walked on water, he walked on water. And if it says that he was raised from the dead, but then you get Christian intellectuals who are scholars, who are smart, who have that kind of commitment, but they use their scholarship in order to support the commitment. It's not that they use their scholarship to find out the truth. They already have the truth. And so they're interested in seeing how they can support the truth. And so that's what happened. In my particular case, I got to a point in my life, probably in my early 20s, mid 20s, where I just said, look, instead of approaching early Christianity and the historical Jesus and the Bible by saying, I already know what it's all about, I'm going to try and prove it, instead of that, why don't I just read the Bible and see if it has mistakes? And why don't I actually think about, how one could explain miracles, or why don't I actually use my brain to figure it out and then decide whether it's inerrant, and then decide whether he was raised. Instead of assuming what I wanted to conclude, I thought I should actually do the study. And so that's my approach. And so the approach is completely different from what someone like William Lane Craig or these other apologists do, because I'm open to whatever I find. And if I find something that supports a religious claim, okay, I'll believe the religious claim. But it's not because I'm going to begin by believing the. I'm going to look for the evidence one way or the other. And so it's a very, very different approach.
Sorry, I've got myself muted here. Understanding Jesus is a bit difficult in isolation of the Old Testament. Obviously, the prophecies, the dynamics, Jesus, and all the Jesus-like figures around the Roman being in in charge of the area. The Old Testament, there are alleged prophecies of the coming of the Messiah. Are they true prophecies? Are they generic statements that can be explained in many different ways if you wish to? And how was the Messiah to be expected, and what kind of Messiah were the Jews expecting?
Yeah, okay, so these are very complicated questions, and we could spend 5 hours just on this particular question. It's really important and really good question. Jesus, of course, was a Jew, and his followers were Jewish, and they inherited a Bible. They grew up with the Hebrew Bible. That was their Bible. Jesus himself was completely Jewish. There's nothing non-Jewish about him. There's nothing to suggest that Jesus wanted to start a new religion. He understood himself as Jewish and as having a correct interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. After his death, probably during his life, some of his disciples thought that he might be the Messiah who was to be expected. And to make sense of what I have to say, I've got to spend a couple minutes actually talking about how this works, because most people don't know what the term Messiah even means. The term Messiah, as you know, comes from the Hebrew word Mashiach, which means anointed one. And it's a word they used in the Old Testament for nothing particularly supernatural. It was used to refer to the King of Israel, and other people too, but especially the King of Israel, because he was the one who was called the Anointed One of God. During the coronation ceremony of an Israelite king, King David or King Solomon, they'd have oil poured on their head during the coronation ceremony to indicate that they were standing under God's special favor. And so they were anointed with oil, so they were called the Anointed One, the Mashiach. The greatest king of Israel's history was David, and God promised David, this is in the book of 1 Samuel, he promised David that he would always have a descendant on the throne in Jerusalem, that he would have there'd be a dynasty, a Davidic dynasty that would go on forever. And in fact, the dynasty lasted for 500 years. And so it's pretty amazing. I mean, it went on for 500. There was a Davidic king on the throne until the Babylonians destroyed Judea, destroyed the temple, and got rid of the Jewish king. Some Jewish thinkers after that thought that since God had promised that David would always have a descendant on the throne, that God is not going to renege on his promise. So God will God will restore a king to Israel who would be a descendant of David. And so the Mashiach, the Anointed One, the Messiah, was to be a descendant of David, who would be like David, to be a military leader, a political leader, to be a king of Israel who would govern the people and make it a great nation. So in the days of Jesus, there are various expectations about what the Messiah would be, but the dominant one was that they'd be a military political leader of Israel who would rule from Jerusalem. And some of Jesus' disciples thought that that's who he was. They thought he's the one that God is sending to be the king. So what ends up happening, of course, is that Jesus doesn't set up a kingdom in Israel and doesn't drive out the enemy and doesn't make Israel a sovereign state. He gets arrested by the enemy and he gets crucified. I mean, he's publicly executed for crimes against the state, tortured to death. And so that was just the opposite of what the Messiah was supposed to be. The Messiah is supposed to destroy the enemy, and Jesus got squashed by the enemy. So his disciples, who had thought he was the Messiah, were, that didn't, obviously were completely blown out of the water by his crucifixion. But then some said that he got raised from the dead. And they started thinking that maybe he is the Messiah. In fact, they thought he is the Messiah, but not in the sense that we ever thought. Once they came to that idea that he was some kind of spiritual Messiah, or that he was a Messiah who was going to come first to suffer and then to rule, they came up with this different idea of the Messiah. They had to find that Messiah in the Hebrew Bible. And that's where the biblical prophecies come from. When Christians talk about Jesus fulfills prophecy, they're referring to passages that the early Christians decided referred to this kind of suffering Messiah. These passages, such as Isaiah 53 or Psalm 22, and there's a whole list of them, do not mention the Messiah. And they're not originally talking about the Messiah, but they are talking about somebody, for example, who is a righteous man who suffers and God vindicates him. And they say, that's Jesus. So this passage must be talking about the Messiah. And so they find all of these passages so that today when Christians read the Old Testament, they see these passages and they say, predicting Jesus. But the passages were not originally talking about that. And when you read them, it's clear they're not talking about that if you actually read them in their context. But, and so, so that, I'm sorry, it's kind of a long answer, but it could go much longer.
No, it's a complex issue for sure. We talked about biases, and we focused to start with on the biases from the faithful camp, but you'd be biased yourself if you just focus on one area, because on the other side, some fellow atheists like the fact that if there's no Jesus, there's no problem. Or if this was made up by Constantine 300 years later, there's no problem. The whole thing is fabricated. But history is, you follow the scientific method and you don't go where you wish things to be. You just follow the evidence. So let's get this out of the way. Obviously, the mythicist movement and those who talk about how Christianity was made some 300 years after the event.
Yeah, right. So, okay, so my view of things is that everybody has biases. It's not that some of us are unbiased and everybody else is biased. And so that's the first thing. I don't believe there is such a thing as being unbiased, because we're human beings. We're not rocks. We're human beings, and so we have thoughts and emotions and backgrounds and views and like worldviews, and we have everything. And so, but the question is, what do you do with those biases? Do you simply allow them to dictate what you think happened in history, or do you go through the historical method and see what happened in history? In my view, the mythicists are just as bad as the fundamentalists, because they have a view that they want to be true and they shape everything so that it turns out they are right. And so, but I think the mythicists especially shoot themselves in the foot, because they argue that Jesus was not a human being. There really never was a man Jesus at all. It's not that there are stories told about him that didn't happen, or that they're exaggerations, or that people are making up stuff about him. It's that he never existed. And you think, are you crazy? I mean, so, I know there are smart people who think this, but mainly, I think they just shoot themselves in the foot, because most people who actually look at the evidence say, look, you're just making a silly argument. And it's making yourself look bad. Why don't you just, why not just do history instead of making up your own stuff and calling it history? So so that's my view. I think that they're just completely biased in the other direction, and will tilt anything they can and just say ridiculous things in order to prove their point. And people who aren't trained as historians read this and they think, oh, that sounds convincing. Yeah, well, okay. Do some history and then see if it sounds convincing.
Yeah. So, I mean, some mythologies are, I'm kind of Egyptian, and I've got that Horus and Isis sort of mythology, and a lot of people debate, born on the 25th of December, born of a virgin, resurrected after the third day. Oh, here's Jesus, this Jesus all over again. It's happening, and it's happening, but it's different story, isn't it?
Well, it is different stories, and it's not just Isis and Osiris; it's also Mithras, and it's just, you pick your god, and then you start saying, oh yeah, he was born on December 25th, and 3 wise men came and visited him, and by the way, his mother was a virgin, and you just make stuff up. But if you actually look at the ancient sources that talk about these other divinities, it's not like that. So I am not saying. Look, I think that the stories about Jesus were molded around ideas about divinity in his day. So that's absolutely right. You have other people who are partially human, partially divine, whose mother might be a mortal and father might be an immortal, and so you absolutely get stories like that. But just because you have stories that are made up about a person does not mean the person himself didn't live. There are all sorts of stories made up about Barack Obama, but it doesn't mean he didn't live. How do you decide if he lived? It's not because he has crazy stories told about him. You do the history. So, yeah.
Yeah. So just I was thinking about it the other day. The very simple game of telephone or Chinese whisper. You've got 50 kids in a row, and the kid at the very end is probably going to end up getting it completely wrong. But the very first kid will have a very, very good account of what has been uttered to him or her. Would that work with sort of history? Would be the first closer account to the incident will be the most reliable? So the early writings of Christianity will be the more reliable than later ones?
It's not necessarily the case. As a general rule of thumb, if you've got a source that is, say, a year removed from an event, it's more likely to be accurate than a source that's 50 years removed from the event. It's more likely, but it's not necessarily the case. The one who's 1 year away might have just been making stuff up, and the one 50 years away might have been hearing something from somebody who might have gotten their accounts from someone who was 6 months away. So the one 50 years later could, in theory, be more accurate. But as a general rule, as time goes on, stories develop and change. And so the historical method doesn't involve simply seeing what's their earliest source. That is how scholars used to deal with the historical Jesus back in the 19th century, especially. In the 19th century, there was a big search of figuring out which of the Gospels is the earliest. And they decided it was Mark. And they're probably right about that. It probably was Mark. But then they thought, well, that means that Mark is accurate. No, it doesn't make Mark as accurate. It means he's earlier, and it means you need to take him with special seriousness. But if John is the last gospel, it doesn't mean that it necessarily is inaccurate. You have to apply rigid historical criteria to anything. Not just Jesus, but to any historical figure. Julius Caesar or George Washington or whatever. You have to have some ways of knowing what makes it more probable that this happened rather than that, and then you apply those criteria rigorously. And one of the things is, of course, you look for the earliest sources you've got.
Right. So you obviously it's not a default setting. You still have to look into it quite clearly. A lot of Christians, especially the Arabic Christians, being from Egypt, Iraq, Syria, don't have a lot of background about the languages the original texts were written in. So a lot of them read the Bible in Arabic. Some of them think that they were first released in Arabic, or at least Aramaic or Hebrew, which is the closest languages of that area. But when they get faced by the fact that we're Greek and written in a certain type of Greek, and the actual writers or the alleged writers of the Gospels aren't really the writers, they get really shocked and offended and get very upset and say, that's not true. If Mark wasn't Mark, then it would have been called the Gospel of Mark.
Yeah. Well, not just Arabic-speaking Christians or former Christians, but also English-speaking Christians. In America, people get very upset if you say that their translation of the Bible has a problem. Especially in America, the King James translation was for centuries was the thing in English, and there are people who think that this is the Bible that God inspired. And you point out, well, actually, that translation didn't get made till 1,500 years later. It's but it's the same with the Arabic translations. They are later translations. The Hebrew, the Old Testament, of course, is written in Hebrew, which is a Semitic language, so it's more closely related to Arabic. But the New Testament was written in Greek, which is a completely different language group. And so the way you get an Arabic translation is that you have a translator who decides what the Greek actually originally said, and then he or she translates it into Arabic. But knowing what the Greek itself originally said is really difficult because we don't have the originals. And so, like you mentioned Mark, for example, and Mark, we don't know who wrote the Gospel of Mark. We don't. The author does not tell us his name. He never says, I am Mark. And so later tradition said it was this person named Mark, who of course is important for Egyptian Christianity. But we don't know who wrote it. We don't know where he wrote it. It's usually thought that it's written in the city of Rome around the year 70. And I don't think we really have any idea of whether it was written in Rome or not, but it was written in Greek. And when Mark wrote his gospel, we don't have the thing he wrote. Somebody made a copy of that, and then somebody made a copy of that copy, then somebody made a copy of that copy of that copy. And hundreds of years later, we finally get a complete copy. So after hundreds of years of copy, and all these copies have differences in them. So whoever wrote Mark, we have to figure out what he wrote. And then the Arabic translator, based on the scholarship of others, takes the Greek text that people think that he probably is as close as we can get to what Mark wrote, and then translates it into Arabic. Of course, something gets lost in translation, especially if you're moving from a Indo-European language to a Semitic language. It's very hard to translate some things, just as it's hard going the other direction. So anyway, yeah, I know people get upset when they find out that, in fact, these things are complicated. You just assume you pick up a Bible, you read Mark, you read what Mark wrote, and you know exactly what he said, and it's not that easy, unfortunately.
I mean, some very knowledgeable people, they got some sort of information because it's widely spread. I've listened to a conversation between yourself and Sam Harris where he said, well, the road to Damascus and Saul became Paul after Jesus appeared to him. But all my researches have yielded that Saul, his name was never changed to Paul. It's not like Simon and Peter. It's not like Abram and Abraham or Sarai or Sarah. It was actually just his name in Greek as opposed to Hebrew. Would that be right?
Yeah, that's probably right. So Paul himself has left us a number of letters. So there are 13 letters in the New Testament that claim to be written by Paul, and scholars debate whether 6 of them actually were written by, but they kind of doubt that Paul wrote 6 of them. But you do have 7 letters written by Paul, and he always calls himself Paul. Doesn't call himself anything else. But the other book in the New Testament that talks about him is the book of Acts, which is an account of the missionary journeys of the early Christians, especially Paul. And before he becomes a Christian, his name is Saul. And so people think that he was Saul before he became a Christian, then he became a Christian, and they changed his name to Paul. But even in the book of Acts, that's not how it works. Saul is his Hebrew name. Paul is his Greek name. And even after he converts in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, he's still called Saul sometimes if somebody's speaking Hebrew. And so it's not that his name changed. It's just like some people have 2 different names depending on what country they're in.
So we the historians sort of acknowledge that Paul would be the very first to write about Christianity properly, probably maybe around 20 to 25 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. Do you think Paul is the true founder of Christianity? Not that he established the crucifixion or the possible divinity of Jesus, but spreading it to those who are probably sensitive with their genitalia and not wanting to be circumcised.
Right. So Paul is often called either the founder of Christianity or the co-founder of Christianity. And my view is that that's taking the matter a little bit too far. I think Paul was very, very important, but not because he founded Christianity. So, before Paul, both the book of Acts and Paul himself say that before he was a follower of Jesus, he was a persecutor of the Christians. He appears to have converted about 3 years after Jesus' death. And there were Christians already in the world who were saying that Jesus' death and resurrection bring about salvation. So Paul didn't make up that idea. That was around probably Jesus' earliest followers. As soon as they came to believe that he got raised from the dead, as soon as they came to think that, they started saying that his death was God's way of bringing salvation to the world, and that God raised him from the dead. So that Paul knew about that. That's why he was persecuting the church, because these followers of Jesus are saying that he's the Messiah, and Paul's saying he's a crucified criminal. What do you mean he's the Messiah? He's not the Messiah. And so that's why he persecuted him, until he himself had some kind of vision of Jesus, apparently, and converted. But his innovation was not the idea that Jesus' death and resurrection brings salvation. That was already around. His innovation was, he realized that if that's true, that if Jesus' death and resurrection brings salvation, then the law of the Jews is not what brings salvation, and is not what makes somebody one of the chosen ones. It's following the Messiah, Jesus, which means a person can be right with God. A person can be saved with God, not by keeping the law, but by following Jesus, which means that Gentiles don't have to become Jews. So this is the innovation, because before Paul, the Jesus followers just assumed that if you're going to be a follower of the Jewish Messiah, you got to be Jewish. I mean, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. He was sent from the Jewish God. He was sent to the Jewish people to fulfill the Jewish law. This is Jewish. And so Gentiles were welcome to join the faith, the belief in Jesus. But of course, they had to be Jewish. Paul decided, no, actually, this is independent of the Jewish law. So Gentiles don't have to convert to Judaism. And once Paul decided that, it made it possible for the followers of Jesus to become a worldwide movement, not just a sect within Judaism, but actually something that anybody, and that's why Christianity is able to take over the world. Because if Christianity had their world, the Western world at the time, the Roman Empire, the reason it took over the Roman Empire is because it was no longer just a Jewish sect. If it had remained a Jewish sect, there's no way we would have taken over the Roman Empire. You're not going to have millions of men getting circumcised and keeping kosher and observing the Sabbath. It's not going to happen. So so Paul was very, very important, but not in terms of establishing what Christianity was in terms of the belief in Jesus.
So, I mean, I've lived my faith some time ago, and I've read the Bibles many times, but I remember listening to one of your lectures, and one of the pointers to properly read the Gospels, and people read them vertically. Usually you finish one and you start the other, and you finish the stories, and you might just, look very pretty similar. But once you start reading them horizontally and compare story by story, things start to appear to you, and progressively you start to become a bit sophisticated in your understanding and hear a different tone in every gospel, a different message, a different type of angle. What can you tell us about that? Yeah, so the thing is, the thing with the Bible is that since it comes to between two covers, normally the way you read a book between two covers is you start at the beginning and you go to the end, and you assume it's the same author. And so when you pick up a novel or something, it's the same author all the way through. And so when people pick up the Bible, they just assume it's the same author all the way through, and that's God. And so they, it's going to have the same story. It's not going to change his mind halfway through the story. He's going to keep the same story. And it's that way with the Gospels. And so you read Matthew, and it's about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And you read Mark, about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Sounds like Matthew. Then you read Luke, the life, death, and Jesus. Sounds like, and John's different, but it's the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And it all sounds the same. So what I try to get my students to do is what you're suggesting is, I'm not saying you absolutely should read the Bible this way, where you start at the beginning of the book and go to the end of the book. So you start at the beginning of Matthew and you read through it. But you read from the top of the page to the bottom of the page, then you go to the next page, and you should read it that way. I call that a vertical reading. You start at the top and you go to the bottom. And of course, you should read books like that. But with the Gospels, especially, since you got 4 of them written by different authors at different times in different places to different authors, it's also useful to read them horizontally, which means you read a story in one gospel, then you read the same story in another gospel, and you read them very carefully next to each other, and you start looking for what's different.
what's the same and what's different. And when you read them like that, you realize, wait a second, that sounded the same, but now that I look at it, this one says this and this one says that. And wait, I can't reconcile that. And so when you do it that way, then you start realizing, oh my God, this one is trying to emphasize this point, and this one's trying to emphasize a different point. And to get there, and so when you do it like that, you just have all of these insights that you wouldn't have otherwise. And so I have my students do this all the time. I tell them, okay, you've got two accounts of Jesus' birth. One is in Matthew, one is in Luke. Simply read through Matthew's account. Start with the very beginning and list everything that happens point by point by point by point. Go through the whole thing, list all the points. Then read Luke's account, do the same thing, make a list, point by point, 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 and compare your lists. And when students do that, they say, oh my God, I had no idea. Yeah, of course you didn't have any idea. You've never done it before. But you do that, you realize, wow, they're not only telling difference, virtually every story is different between the two, but they say some things that you can't reconcile. So that's how I try to get my students, not in place of just reading them normally, but do that exercise too.
Of course, this sort of reading lead to what seem to be contradictions, but a proper scholar would look and say, well, that's not a contradiction. There's a mention of a woman in a certain scene, but the omitting of that woman in that scene doesn't mean necessarily it's a contradiction. It's just a different point of view. However, Christian apologists, when they try to apologize for this sort of thing, they do fortunately, a typical straw man where they start apologizing for things they're not considered to be contradictions to start with, and leave out the real contradictions.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, no, it's a real game that sometimes people play. But the thing is, just because you have two accounts of a story, that in itself is not a contradiction. Just to give you an example, in the gospel, in terms of the birth narrative, in the Gospel of Matthew, you have the wise men coming to worship the infant Jesus. And Luke doesn't have that. Luke has the shepherds coming to worship the infant Jesus. Okay, so if you're a Christian apologist defending the Bible, you say that's not a contradiction. Why are you calling that a contradiction? But I never call it a contradiction. It's not a contradiction. Matthew's telling one story, Luke's telling another story. That's not a problem. Of course, people do that all the time. That's fine. The problem is when Matthew says something and Luke says something, and you cannot reconcile them. Because, for just as an example in this particular story, in Matthew's account, when Jesus, the king of Israel, finds out that Jesus, the king of the Jews, has been born, and he sends out the troops to kill him, the baby. And so Joseph and Mary flee to Egypt to escape the wrath of Herod, and they stay there till Herod dies. And then they return. Then they go and they resettle in Nazareth because they can't settle in Bethlehem where they're from. And so you've got this long sequence, and it's got to be months, years that they're in Egypt, right? Then they go north. In Luke's account, Jesus is born, and a month and a half later, they return direct after being in Jerusalem, in Bethlehem and Jerusalem, right next to each other. They return to Nazareth. And so, well, if they're right, they go right to Nazareth, 45 days later or something. How can Matthew be right that they go down to Egypt and stay there for months, right? So that's a contradiction. And so it's really weird when you have. So I had this debate. I don't know if you saw this debate. I did this debate in England a couple of years ago with Pete Williams, who's a friend of mine that I like very much, and he wrote a book called something like "Can We Trust the Gospels?" And he has a chapter that deals with contradictions. And he goes through a number of contradictions to show they're not really contradictions. And none of the contradictions he talks about does anyone think is a contradiction. And so it looks like he wins the argument, but so we had this debate. I said, well, these are not the ones that people point to as contradictions. Why don't you deal with the ones that people say really are contradictions? And I know the answer why he doesn't deal with those, because it's hard to resolve those. But it's easy to resolve ones that aren't really contradictions.
Well, that trip to Egypt is quite interesting because there is a tree or a palm tree in Egypt that's sort of forever green, and people would go there to get some blessings where Mary and Jesus were supposed to have been there, which is an interesting story. But
But that story's not in the Gospels, by the way. That story comes from a later
Yes.
apocryphal gospel, the Gospel of Pseudo Matthew.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And it seems that the Quran gets a lot of its stories from later accounts. There's a lot of stuff. We talked about the Bible of Barnabas, which is, I believe, it's a 16th century forgery where Jesus is depicted as only a prophet of God, and there is a mention of Muhammad being the prophet of God. So there's obviously a lot of gospels that never made it. One of the knowledge of Christianity that people get from Dan Brown's novel, The Da Vinci Code, is that Jesus somehow ended in France and stuff like that. But the Nicene Creed, where a lot of Muslims, still right to this point, Muslims and some Christians think that the Nicene Creed was about whether Jesus was God or not.
Yeah, I know.
And please correct that for us.
Yeah. So right. Yeah. So Dan, is the Da Vinci Code read in? Do people in the Middle East read the Da Vinci Code in Arabic translation? I don't know.
They probably they watched the movie.
They watched the movie. Okay. Yeah. Good enough. Good enough.
I was looking at some stats the other day, Bart. Unfortunately, in the Middle East, the average person reads 0.98 book per annum, as opposed to 80 books per annum per Japanese. So they watched the movie. They haven't read the book.
Most Americans don't read much either, but they read more than that, but not. So all right. So the idea that that the Council of Nicaea. So let me give some historical background. The Council of Nicaea was in the year 325 CE. It was called by the Emperor Constantine, who was the first Roman emperor to become a Christian. And so he had been a Christian for 13 years at this point. And there was a division in the church there was a theological controversy. And the council was called to solve the theological controversy. And in Dan Brown's book and in the movie, The Da Vinci Code, what is said is that the council was called in order to decide whether Jesus was the Son of God. And that's completely wrong. So the council had we don't know exactly, but one later tradition said that there were 318 church leaders, bishops, who came to this council in the city of Nicaea to debate the theological issue. But every one of them agreed that Jesus was the Son of God before the council. Everybody in Christianity had agreed that Jesus was the Son of God for 300 years. And so this was not the issue being debated. And everybody agreed that Jesus is more than just kind of some human Son of God. Everybody agreed that Jesus in some sense was God, that he existed before he was born, and that he became a human being from being a divine being to be a human being. So again, I'm not saying that I agree with that. I'm just saying everybody at the council agreed with that. So the reason the council was called was for a much more detailed issue, which was some people in Christianity thought that the way they tried to figure out how Jesus could be God if God is God, but there's only one God. I mean, if there's only one God, but you've got two gods, that doesn't work. And so the council's called to figure out how it works so that you can stay monotheist. You stay there's one God, but you can also say that Jesus is God. And the two options were the option by a guy named Arius, Arius, a guy named Arius, was a very popular option, which said that ultimately there's only one God, but in the eternity past, this God begot a son. He had a son. He brought his son into existence, and the son was very, 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 very powerful. And the son created the universe, and later became a human and died for the sake of others. But the Son of God was like a second-level divinity who is subordinate to God the Father. There's one ultimate God, and the Son is where you have access to this ultimate God. And so he came into existence at some point, and he's not nearly as powerful or great as the truth. That was Arius's view. That was a very, very popular view. The other view was his opponent, a guy named Alexander, who was actually his own bishop, who said no. In fact, Christ did not come into existence at some point. Christ always existed. Christ has always existed, and he's not subordinate to God. He's equal with God. He and God are complete. They are the same substance. They're made up of the same stuff, and they both go back all the way, and they've always been in this father-son relationship. And so they're co-eternal, co-powerful. They just have different functions, but they are so unified that there's only one God. This leads, of course, to the doctrine of the Trinity, where you get the Father, Son, and Spirit. And in Christian traditional thinking, there are these three persons. They're all different from each other, but they're so unified there's only one God. So the issue of the Council of Nicaea was not whether Jesus was the Son of God. It was in what sense is he the Son of God? In what sense is he the Son of God? Because everybody agreed he was the Son of God. And then the Orthodox view that emerged was that they're unified forever. They're equal and unified forever. So the other thing people say about the Council of Nicaea that's completely wrong, and again, it's in the Da Vinci Code, but people were saying this before that, is that that's where they decided which books would be in the New Testament. And that is not true. That is not a decision at the Council of Nicaea. They didn't talk about that issue. That issue got resolved much later.
Right. One of the other things that it's been sort of debated, and especially in the Middle East, about Constantine, whether he's the one that made the numbers on Christianity. My understanding, he started something. He converted to Christianity, but he made Christianity one of the religions. They're admissible for worship, but it was Theodosius, by the looks of things, that made things really happening.
Yeah. So one of the books I recently wrote was called The Triumph of Christianity. And it was an attempt to show how it is that Christianity took over the Roman Empire. And it's a pretty intriguing and important story, because if the New Testament's right, and it's got to be right on this point, after Jesus' death, hardly anybody believed in him. Even in the New Testament, his disciples came to believe he got raised from the dead, and there was a handful of women, so like 20 people. Right away, you start off with 20 Christians in the world in an empire of 60 million. And so by the end of the 4th century, so 350 years later, there are like 30 million Christians. And so how do you get from 20 people to 30 million people who are now like not worshiping the pagan gods, but are worshiping, the God of Jesus? And so my book is trying to explain how that happens. And when I started working on the book, I thought what almost everybody seems to think, that it's all because of Constantine. Constantine, the emperor, converted, and then everybody followed suit. And that's what I really thought until I did the research, and I realized, no, that is not how it happened. And what I show in my book is that it would have happened even if Constantine had not converted, that he's not the reason. And so it's true that after Constantine converted, Christianity took off in the empire. But what I show in my book is that the rate of conversion was happening at such a rate that it was an exponential curve, and that he was right when it was curving up, and the exponential curve was going there. And so it's important that he converted, because for one thing, it made it more possible for the Roman aristocrats, the leaders, the elite, to convert, because the emperor's converted now, so we can convert too. So it made that possible. But I think it would have happened anyway.
Yeah, so you don't need the power of persuasion. All you need is the power of being able to mate like rabbits and steady birth rates.
That's it. And he didn't make other religions illegal, as you said. What he did is he made Christianity legal, but he explicitly says he and his co-emperor issued an edict in the year 313. So this is 12 years before the Council of Nicaea. In the year 313, just a year after he converted, he and his fellow emperor issued something that's been known as the Edict of Milan, which was about religious freedom in the Roman Empire. And this edict said you can be any religion you want. You can be Christian. You can be any of the traditional Roman religions. You can be Jewish. You can be anything you want. That there's no more persecution of religion. And so it's the first document in history that we know of that provided religious tolerance. And so Constantine was not interested in converting people to Christianity. He just wanted people to get along, and he liked Christianity, and then a lot of people followed suit. But yeah, so freedom of religion was really what he was more interested in.
Right. Going back to the four Gospels, and we talked about the first angle about the contradictions, but the other bit, which is once you start reading them in many different ways, vertically, horizontally, and then you start seeing the tone and the different messages and the evolution of the Christ. Mark, it's a guy who doesn't know what the hell is happening to him, and he's just completely sort of resigned to the fact that the stuff is happening to him, and people don't understand what's going on. All the way to John, where he's completely self-assured and he knows exactly what's going on, and it's all in the plan. It's all intentional.
Yeah. That's right. It's one of the most interesting things is how Jesus understands what's going to happen. I think Mark is the most interesting in many ways, because 3 times in Mark during his ministry, Jesus predicts that he has to go to Jerusalem and be rejected and crucified and raised from the dead. And so it sounds like he knows what's going on. But then when you get to the actual event, he doesn't seem to understand what's going on. And he's like in shock. And at the end, the only thing he says throughout his entire crucifixion scene is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it's like, what's going on? He doesn't seem to know. And you're right. As you get through the Gospels, when you get to Luke, which is later than Mark, in Luke, Jesus is calm and assured. He doesn't say, why have you forsaken me? He says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And then he says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And so he doesn't feel forsaken of God at all in Luke. When you get to the Gospel of John, it's even more extreme. I mean, he is in control of the situation himself. He's controlling the events. he's in charge here. And so what it's doing is it's showing that Christians over time had to wrestle with what would Jesus' own attitude be toward this event that he was required to do, his crucifixion. And the more they started seeing him as a divine being and less as just a human being, the more they thought, well, he had to be all-knowing and he had to be all-powerful, and so he must be controlling the events. So Mark has him portrayed more on the human level, and John more on the divine level.
There's always that philosophical and even neurological conversation about free will. Did Judas have any?
Yeah. Well, our understandings of free will are, of course, driven by our understanding of human psychology and by all sorts of philosophical developments since the Enlightenment, as you know. And ancient people realized they could do whatever they felt like, to a limit, but they didn't have the kind of the philosophical sense of free will, let alone the neurological understanding of whether we really do have free will. They didn't have any of that. But it is an interesting question about Judas, because, of course, Judas betrays Jesus, and in Christian tradition, he's condemned for it, and it's often thought that he's like the worst sinner of all time. But on the other hand, if he hadn't betrayed Jesus, then Jesus wouldn't have died for your sins. And so why are you condemning him? It wasn't necessary. And so that's the tension within the Christian tradition. But the earliest Christians didn't seem to feel much of a tension. They said, yeah, okay. Yeah, this is bad. It is interesting, Judas only commits suicide in one of the Gospels. In the Gospel of Matthew, he hangs himself. And there's only one other reference to Judas's death in the New Testament. That's in the book of Acts. It's not in one. The other Gospels just leave him off the story once he betrays Jesus. But Matthew hangs himself. In Acts, this is a place where it seems to me to be another contradiction. In Acts, Judas doesn't hang himself. The way he dies is he falls forward on the ground, and his bowels spill out all over and bleeds all over this field. And that's how he dies. And doesn't sound like hanging, because he falls head first and onto the ground. So it's one of these things that's probably a contradiction.
Two-footed Judas there, yeah, a bit clumsy. It's interesting because when you think about Judas, and I think there is a Bible, the Gospel of Judas, where he was so necessary. I mean, if he didn't do that, the crucifixion would have not happened probably, and he was so required in the equation. So he's almost fulfilling the prophecy. He had to do it.
Yeah, the Gospel of Judas is the most important recent gospel to appear. It's only been available for less than, well, I don't know, it's I don't know, 15 years or something. I forget exactly, but it's recent, and it's very interesting. When it was discovered and became public, most people, including me, read it as showing that Judas was actually the good guy, and I still think he is the good guy, but it's a more nuanced view. It's kind of a complicated view of Judas's view in this gospel, because he's not really, well, anyway. So he's not absolutely good, but he's better than the other disciples. And Jesus has this one line that Judas is greater than the others because he's going to sacrifice the man who clothes me, says Jesus. So the idea is that the divine Christ is somehow stuck in his body, and Judas is going to make it possible for this divine Christ to escape his bodily imprisonment. And so this makes Judas deed a good thing, because it's going to make it possible for salvation. So that's good. And so Judas isn't like the worst. He's better than all the others, even though he's not as good as some who aren't in the story.
Just a little bit away from the biblical and studies and gospel, do you still see, and I love the fact that you changed the original old name of the problem of evil to suffering, and it's a lot more fitting to me, because I think evil is quite relative, and you can play around and you can apologize for it in so many different ways. But the problem of suffering, and I believe it's the one that really broke the camel's back for you. Do you still see it in the same way? It is still problematic, and it still continues to anchor you in your position?
Yeah, so as I was saying earlier, I had been this fundamentalist Christian, and I for a number of years, and I went to a Bible college, and I went to an evangelical liberal arts college, Wheaton College, and I was a firm believer in the Bible. And over time, as I did my scholarship, I started realizing that the Bible is not really what I thought it was, and that that there are mistakes in the Bible, there are errors, and so I remained a Christian. Most Christians have never thought that the Bible was completely inerrant, but that was my kind of Christianity. I left that and became a fairly liberal Christian. I still believe the Bible was the way that God spoke to people, and I thought God was involved in the world. And that was my belief for a number of years. Probably about 25 years or so ago, I started wrestling even more with the problem of suffering in the world, why it is that people suffer. I mean, if God is active in the world and he intervenes in the world, he answers prayer, he sent Jesus to bring salvation, and he helps people when they're in need, why is it so many people aren't helped? Why is there so much suffering in the world? And a lot of it is because of what you were saying earlier. People talk about free will. Well, if I decide to punch you in the nose and I break your nose, well, okay, it's just because I chose to do that. It's not God's fault. I chose to do that. So there's a lot of suffering that you could account for with free will, including wars and all sorts of things. But there are a lot of things that have nothing to do with people's free will. When a tsunami kills 300,000 people overnight, that's not anybody's free will. That's a tsunami, or a hurricane, or a volcano, or an earthquake, or pick your natural disaster. And I got to a point where I just thought, if God is active in the world, and he really is answering my prayers, and he is concerned about people, and he's able to keep people from suffering if he really wants to, do I really think that? So I did a bunch of reading, of course. I knew what biblical scholars had said and theologians. I read what philosophers said. And I just read. Read. And finally I got to a point where I said, I don't believe it anymore. I just think it makes better sense to say that there is not a God who's active in this world. Because if he's active in the world, we wouldn't have so many children starving the entire time. And we wouldn't have, we just wouldn't have stuff like tsunamis and earthquakes and things. We just wouldn't have it. And so I don't believe in God anymore. I'm I'm an atheist. And I mean, if somebody asks me, do you know that there's not another God? There's not a God? And I said, no, I don't know. How the hell would I know? I don't know. So in that sense, I'm an agnostic. I don't know. But if you ask me, do you believe there's another God? No, I don't believe there's a God. No. I mean, if there were, I don't see how you could explain all this. So I consider myself both an agnostic and I don't know, but an atheist because I don't really believe it.
Yeah, well, most sort of sophisticated atheists now no longer go with the positive atheism, where we know there's no God. And nobody says that anymore, unless you're a nutter, because you've got a burden of proof then. So,
well, but there are people who are harder atheists than others, as you know, and some are kind of lightweight atheists, and some are kind of heavyweight atheists, and a lot of people in the middle. So I'm probably somewhere in the middle somewhere.
Yeah, well, I'm very much the same place as yourself. Now, usually your blog, it gets introduced at the very beginning or the very end, but I wanted to introduce it right on the back of the problem of suffering,
Okay.
because instead of waiting for that God to come and help us all, you have taken things into your own hands. And please tell us about your blog and what it does for other people.
Yeah, so even when I was a Christian, I thought that, even though God answers prayer and things, that really, there's people need to be doing things for other people. And I read that as kind of the essence of the gospel of Jesus' message, is that you need to love your neighbor as yourself, which really means actually doing things for people in need. So about 10 years ago or so, I started thinking, I'm doing all this work and things, and I'm not really doing enough to help people in need. And I thought, maybe I should volunteer at the soup kitchen, and spend 10 hours a week at the soup kitchen. Then I thought, there might be a way for me to use some talents that I have, or some things that I can do that other people have other talents. They don't do the kinds of things I do to make a difference. And so actually 9 years ago that it started, 2012, my blog. So it's called the Bart Ehrman blog. And anybody can just look it up online, just spelled like my name, the Bart Ehrman blog. And what it is it's devoted to the New Testament and early Christianity, the things I know about. I post 5 times a week. And so I put out a blog post 5 times a week. It's usually 1,200 to 1,400 words a day, 5 times a week, on everything. I mean, having to do with everything we've been talking about here, from the historical Jesus to the Gospels that didn't make it into the New Testament, to early Christianity, up to the Emperor Constantine, his conversion, like everything. Probably more focus on the New Testament because most people are more interested in that, or the historical Jesus and things. But I also talk about the problem of suffering. I talk about the Hebrew Bible. I talk about ancient Jewish religions. I talk about ancient Greek and Roman religions. So I do like anything relevant to the New Testament, early Christianity. The thing is that people have to pay a membership fee to be on the blog, and it's not a high fee, but it's really it's extremely affordable. And if people can't afford it, they just tell me, and I give them a free membership. But there are different levels of membership, so people can get my posts. Some people can, at a higher level, pay a little bit more, can make comments, and I answer every question I get. And so I do this. So it's all to raise money for charity, and it's starting to take off. So last year we raised. So what I do is I charge this money, but I don't keep any of it. Like I don't make a dime off of this thing. I give all of the money to charity. The charities, I have 2 international charities and 3 that are more local to where I live. And every penny goes to this charity. So last year we raised over $250,000 on this blog, and it's going to be more this year. It's really starting to take off. So anybody who's listening to this, you should check it out. Just look up the Bart Ehrman blog and see, if you're interested. And the thing is, it has archives that go back 9 years. I mean, I've got it's like every week. I've not missed a week. Every week for 9 years, I've done this, and so there are thousands of these blog posts on just about everything. So that's the Bart Ehrman blog.
Yeah, and guys, it's in the description of this particular broadcast. So the Bart Ehrman's blog, website, as well as YouTube channel are in the description of the video. So please check them out. Bart, we're exactly 1 hour into this, and I understand you've got another commitment. Do you mind if we please spend the next 10 minutes, just 10 minutes, taking some questions? And I'll start with one that is quite interesting, because somebody has found a proof for the resurrection, and he wants to put it forward here, which is basically from saying that the Shroud of Turin proves the resurrection of Christ.
Okay, yeah. So Shroud of Turin is very interesting. So, as with everything, I think that evidence matters. And in this case, the evidence is scientific. There have been analyses of the shroud that show that it's medieval, that it's not ancient. I know people who want to believe this kind of thing are going to believe it no matter what the science says, because they'll say that the tests were tainted, or they'll come up with their excuses. But every scientific test has shown that, in fact, it's not the burial cloth of Jesus. Even if it were a burial cloth that could be dated to first century, even suppose you could date it, you cannot, but suppose you could date it to the 20s or 30s CE in Jerusalem. Would that make it Jesus' burial cloth? No, it wouldn't make it Jesus' burial. There are a lot of people who are buried. So, why would that make it Jesus' burial? And so, I've read the books and I know the arguments, and I'm just telling you, it is not authentic. And so you can believe it if you want, but it's not authentic and doesn't prove the resurrection of Jesus. I will also say that in some forms of Christianity, it's not about proof. Christianity is a matter of faith. And if you have proof, it ain't the same as faith. So if you don't have enough faith, okay.
Won't be called faith then. Yeah, for sure. P's asking a question, about Christianity's Achilles heel. Is it the resurrection? Is it if we can somehow disprove the resurrection, would that be the end of Christianity as we know it?
Yeah. If you could prove that Jesus did not die on the cross, but that he grew up to be an old man and was buried in the cemetery in Nazareth as an old man, then almost every form of Christianity as we know it would disappear. But there would still be plenty of people like me who believe in following what they take to be the most important teachings of Jesus. And so it'd be more like, following a great philosophical school or a great teacher. It'd be like somebody who decides that they want to model their lives after Gandhi or after Martin Luther King, but it wouldn't be worshiping Christ as the Son of God anymore, in my opinion. There would also be people who say, well, he really was God. It's just that the crucifixion story was, but you'd have all sorts of things happen. But the traditional Christianity that we know of in the world, over 2 billion people follow today, most of that would be so radically changed that it wouldn't be what we think of as Christianity anymore. But by the way, you can't disprove the resurrection. How are you going to do that?
Exactly, that I was saying. It's very difficult. It's got to end up being a matter of faith at this point, because we cannot go and verify. We don't even have the guy's DNA, because that's what you ultimately need to prove anything.
Yeah, that would help.
Yeah, that would help. This one is more focused on Old Testament, but it's obviously we're talking about Egypt, or a lot of Egyptians are watching us at the moment. Is there any historical evidence of the Exodus? We're talking about major events in history. Is there anything to suggest that the Jews were truly enslaved in Egypt and build the pyramids, or help build the pyramids, and the Exodus happened, and what have you, and the 40 years in Sinai?
Yeah. Well, the short answer is no. There's no historical or archaeological evidence. There are a couple of things that are kind of interesting. The name Moses appears to be an Egyptian name, and Moses was clearly the legend figure behind the Exodus stories. But within, if you just look at the Exodus stories themselves in the book of Exodus, according to the book of Exodus, the children of Israel have become more numerous than the native residents of Egypt, and that's why they get enslaved. And when God sends them out, there are 600,000 Israelite men of age old enough to be soldiers. 600,000. So not counting younger boys, older men, women, or children. So it's like, okay, what are you talking here? 3 million people or something? And they leave, and there's no trace of them being there. There's nothing in the Sea of Reeds or the Red Sea. There's no like chariots down there, from the escape. And in the book of Exodus, Pharaoh and his entire army get wiped out. Well, there's no record of. So this would have been under one of the Ramses. I mean, it's like, there's no record that Ramses was killed. We still have his mummy. I mean, we still have his. And so like, anyway, so there's no remnants of Israel. These millions of people in the wilderness for 40 years. There's no evidence that this nation entered into what is now Israel and the West Bank and destroyed all these cities. So so people try to find something here and there to base it on, but there's no historical record of it, and there's no archaeological evidence of it. These are later legends that have that circulated over many centuries before they got written down, but there's not a historical basis for it.
Yeah, and I mean, I can sort of tell you as well that obviously the Israeli-Egyptian War, and after the occupation of Sinai in 1967, they had the Sinai Peninsula for a good 7 years, and they gone mad looking for evidence, and they couldn't find any. So, do you think, Bart? Do you think Paul was converted to Christianity, or was called to it? Was it like a political move? They were on the rise, and he saw something that he could play with, or do you believe or think that this was a genuine? The road to Damascus, he saw something of some sort, and the situation is genuine.
Yeah, so there are kind of two aspects to this question, and the first is, was there something genuinely happened? And I think that the answer is yes. I think Paul honestly believed he had a vision of Jesus. I think that he, I don't know what it was he saw. Since I don't think Jesus rose from the dead, I don't think he saw Jesus, but something happened, and he saw something that he took to be Jesus, and he came to believe that Jesus was alive still. Again, they'd come back to life. I don't think Paul was making that up. I think Paul suffered too much for this view to make it plausible that he just like invented it. And I think you have to have something significant to happen to make him turn around. People think that you've got to come up with some explanation for Paul's vision. Like people think, well, he, maybe he was an epileptic and he had a seizure, or maybe he, people have all sorts of views, but the reality is that lots of people have visions. It maybe isn't talked about much, but psychologists know full well that a lot of people have vision. Something like 1 out of 8 of us will have a vision of a lost loved one, where we generally seem to see them after they're dead. It happened, not in a dream, but actually see them, and it just happens. And so the mind's a funny thing. The mind can do all sorts of things and does different things for different people. I think Paul really believed he saw Jesus, and that changed his mind about Jesus completely, and it led him from being a persecutor of Christianity to being the most important early Christian, probably the second most important person in Christianity after Jesus ever. So I think that happened. But another question that scholars throw around is it right to call that a conversion? And a lot of scholars refuse to use the term for Paul, conversion, and kind of relatedly, they refuse to use the term Christianity for the followers of Jesus at that stage of history. Their view is that if somebody converts, they convert either from no religion to religion, or they convert from one religion to another, and they don't want to say that Paul converted from Judaism to Christianity because they think that's inappropriate, because Paul never gave up his Judaism in his view. In their view, Paul and the early Christians continued to see themselves as a continuation of Judaism, not as a separate religion from Judaism. And so there are enormous debates among scholars that can get very heated about when it's appropriate to even start talking about people as Christians as opposed to followers of Jesus, the Jewish Messiah. I somewhat think that these debates are a little bit overdone, and I don't have any problem talking about Christianity in the days of Paul because of how I define the term. I define the term Christian simply as meaning somebody who thinks that Jesus is the way of salvation. They're a follower of Christ because they think that he's the way of salvation. And I think that that happens right away after Jesus' crucifixion. And people will say, yeah, but Christianity hadn't developed yet. You know, they didn't have their creeds yet. They didn't have their Bible yet. They didn't have all sorts of things yet. And I completely agree. That's absolutely right. But at what point did Christianity's evolution stop? When did it become like a thing? It never became a thing. It's always been lots and lots of different things. And so it's not right to say, well, it wasn't Christianity yet, because you have to say, well, it's still not Christianity because we're not agreed on everything. So I think if somebody followed Jesus and thought he was the way of salvation, I would call that person a follower of Christ, a Christian. So I have no problem with saying that Paul converted. He didn't convert from one religion to another. This is an important point. Paul continued to think of himself as Jewish, a Jewish follower of Jesus, but he did convert. He did change his view of Jesus. He converted from one view of Jesus to another view of Jesus, and it made the most enormous difference in understanding how a person is right with God. And so I think there is a conversion in that sense, not from one religion to another, but from one view of religion to another view.
I guess the question to follow here, when was the first word, that word Christian first uttered or first mentioned in history?
People always say, well, you can't find it in the New Testament. And they're wrong. It's in the New Testament twice. It's in the book of Acts, and it's in the book of 1 Peter. And so then people say, well, it was used as a derogatory term. It was meant to say something negative about people, making fun of them. And I don't know, but it means somebody who's a follower of Christ. And so I don't really have any problem with it. And it's already in the New Testament period. And by the early second century, it's just a term people use for followers of Jesus. So it's not the oldest term for followers of Jesus, but it's a pretty good one. I just don't have a problem with it.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, after all, you can't. Marx wasn't the first Marxist, but Marxism is after him, and therefore Jesus couldn't possibly be the first Christian because it was named after his legacy of some sort. Bart, this is the final question for us, and thank you so much for being with us today. The exaggeration of events. Modern history would tell us that this is a human tendency. We've seen Donald Trump appearing in front of 20 or 30,000 people and claiming right on the spot, thanking the 3 or 4 million people turning up and Fox News reporting the same thing. The 5,000 people being fed by Jesus and the 500 people witness his resurrection. Do you think these numbers have got a few zeros next to them?
Yeah, it's very interesting that in the modern world, even when people aren't just exaggerating to boost their egos, it's very hard to judge a crowd. And so you get these different demographic estimates about how things work. And if somebody does have a vested interest in saying, it can be positive or negative. Somebody says, oh, yeah, we had 50,000 people out at our rally. There might have been like 8,000. So you have that kind of building up their ego. But then you have it on the other side, too, when you're trying to show that your enemy is really significant. Oh, my, everyone is against us. The entire population is against us. And you come up with these numbers and you say, yeah, actually, they're both exaggerations. And in the ancient world, it was notorious for exaggerations because they had no way of verifying anything. If you see a Trump rally, you can at least get a photograph and kind of do the counting and figure out, yeah, actually, it's not 50,000 or whatever. But in the ancient world, there's no way to do that. But in the New Testament, you get all of these exaggerations. They've got to be exaggerations. I mean, when Jesus feeds the 5,000 are said to be the men. That's not counting the women and children. So, what are you talking about? 13,000 people, really? So Jesus is like doing these miracles in front of 13,000 people. I mean, how big is Galilee at this time? And like, there's nobody mentions stuff like it's like, yeah. So these are just they're blown up, and So I think the same thing with the 500 who see Jesus at one time, according to Paul. He's the only one who says this, and we don't have any. no evidence of it or anything. So I think numbers get exaggerated. Yes.
Bart, I utterly enjoyed the conversation. Is there a book that you are working on that you want to finish the conversation with, that tell the audience about?
Well, my most recent book is called Heaven and Hell. It came out last year at this time, and it's written for a broad popular audience, and it deals with a pretty interesting question, because most people in America, at least, think most people in America, of course, are Christian, or they're either Christian or they were raised in a Christian household, and almost everybody thinks that when you die, your soul goes to heaven to be rewarded or goes to hell to be punished. So in America, 7 out of 10 people still believe in a literal heaven, and 6 out of 10 believe in a literal hell as a place of punishment where your soul goes. My book shows that this belief in your soul going to heaven or hell is never taught anywhere in the Old Testament, and it's not what Jesus thought. And so my question is, where did it come from then? And why did it become the dominant view in Christianity if it's not the Old Testament, if it's not what Jesus thought? So that's the book, Heaven and Hell, and that's the one I would send people to if they have an inkling to read one of my books.
Professor Ehrman, I enjoyed myself. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I did too. Really interesting questions, and I've enjoyed having the interchange with you.
That's wonderful. Thanks everybody for watching. Until our next episode next week. Thank you.